Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Pari Riahi, and I teach in the architecture department and coordinate the lecture series. And I have the pleasure of realizing a long-term project of mine, which has been to welcome our guest lecturer, Billie Tsien, to our community of UMass architecture. This is an endowed lecture to commemorate Louis A. Tocco and has been granted to us through a generous contribution of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and support from the office of our dean. I would like to thank Dean Emeritus Julie Hayes and our current Dean Barbara Krautheimer, as well as Associate Dean Joey Bowman and the wonderful Lynn Latham, who have continued to support us so that we can hold this lecture. To briefly introduce our guest, whose range of practice covers a wide spectrum, let me start by saying that Billie Tsien and her partner Todd Williams found their practice in 1986 in New York. Some of their notable projects include the Asia Society Hong Kong, the Lefrak Center at Lakeside in Prospect Park, and the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Their current work includes the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, the renovation of David Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center in New York, and the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park, Chicago. Their work has been recognized by numerous national and international citations, including the National Medal of the Arts from President Obama, the 2013 Firm of the Year Award by the AIA, and the 2019 Premium Imperiale presented by the Japan Art Association. Additionally, Ms. Tsien has always taught extensively and continues to do so, and she also serves as the president of the American Academy of the Arts and Letters. She's a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and has been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, National Academy of Design, American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. In a practice that is meticulously engaged in their every undertaking and where the office has had a mission statement that, quote, whatever we design must be of use, but at the same time transcends its use, unquote, architecture is questioned, expanded, and elaborated upon slowly and meticulously, constantly and anew every time. Their practice is exemplary in its vision and dedication, and is unique in its modes of operation. Ms. Tsien, welcome and thank you for joining us and our community this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Harry. I feel very happy to be talking to you, and I'm going to try to do my best with technology and screen sharing. In thinking about this, this is the first time that I've given a lecture. I mean, it's really the sort of beginning of the school year. So it's the first time I've given a lecture publicly that is to students at this time when everything feels like nothing before. And so, you know, I was thinking, what is it that I can talk about? How can I, in some way, I guess, not lead you, but talk about the kinds of things that we're thinking about in our lives too. And I say our lives because, of course, I work with Todd Williams, who's my partner, but also my husband for the past 37 years. So it is, when I talk about a life in architecture, I'm really talking about the two of us. But I titled this Not What I Expected. And it's actually, of course, the situation we're in now is not what any of us could have ever expected, but neither really was architecture. And let's see. Okay, here's the first problem, which Greg will help me with. It's not advancing. Greg, can you help me?
Yes, so if you try clicking on the screen.
Clicking on the screen, all right.
There
Oh,
we go.
just click on the screen.
And
all right.
You should be able to use your arrow buttons from here out.
Okay. This, as you can see, was like 1958. And I grew up being the only we're the only Chinese family in the suburban town in New Jersey in which I grew up. And I think in many ways, I've both felt a sort of part of the American culture, but also kind of outside it, a separate person. And then as I was a young woman, I was very involved with a group called the Feminist Studio Workshop in Los Angeles. And this idea of what does it mean to be an independent woman? And moreover, as I became involved in architecture, who are you in the world of architecture? Architecture has traditionally been very, very male, white male profession. And it's not that much different now. And so it was very confusing to me because I went to architecture school. I loved what I was doing, but it seemed as if you had to either be it was always about the single and sole creator, the one person who has integrity and doesn't ever make concessions to anything else. So there, this is Gary Cooper, Howard Rourke, this is his design, either that or you had to be a kind of diva. And I looked at these two sort of icons of how to practice, and I couldn't find myself in either of them. And then I got married to Todd. We had a son, and everything that you try to control in your architectural life, because I think you study design because you want, in many ways to shape your world. I think the sort of amazing and interesting and wonderful part of having a child is that your world is totally unshaped. It becomes a kind of pile of stuff. And in many ways, this is sort of the way I feel about the world as it is now. One has a conception of the world as you want it to be, and then there's the world as it is. Architecture always seemed like a very clear path, but now it feels as if it's a series of disconnected paths and movements, and how do we move forward? Architecture has always been a profession where we felt that we needed to provide answers and we needed to lead. But I think now what we need to do is learn to listen. And we need to learn to listen in order to lead better. There's so many issues that we're all confronting, whether it's racism, climate change, divisive, corrosive politics, all of those issues. And you think, how can I as a person and how can I as an architect actually have any effect? What is the purpose for what I do? And at the end of President Obama's farewell speech, there was something that he said that really moved me, which is, if something needs fixing, lace up your shoes. And I think that has stayed with me, because I think what we, in so many ways, are faced with are global issues. And there's a kind of global thinking that we need to have. But in order to have a purpose and in order to create an effect, I think you need to be doing things locally, because those things accrue and you can actually have an effect. So lace up your shoes. I think that's how we can move forward. So this is Todd. He doesn't like this picture, but I like this picture because it looks like I'm in charge, but we actually are very much very different people, but because we're so different, we complete each other. But what is also very important about completing each other is our studio, which is about 40 people. And they are truly a family, and that family, I think, is very much focused on making positive changes in the world. So one of the great things about architecture is that it's not the single person and it's not a single creator. It's really a sort of group effort, and there is huge power in groups. So starting with the sort of most personal act is building your own home. And for more than 30 years, Todd and I lived in a very odd space, Carnegie Hall, which you all know as a big recital hall. And there is the sort of famous, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, we actually lived there without practicing. Well, we were practicing architecture, actually. But where that red arrow is pointing to windows which were the apartment where we lived. Of course, down below was this sort of incredible performance hall, which you all know. But surrounding the performance hall were a series of studios, and the studios were quite lively and really full of people who were in some way or other connected to the arts. So, of course, there were ballet classes. There were people who were auditioning for parts, and this is an image of a man named Don Shirley, who was a classical pianist, and he was actually the subject of a film called The Green Book, and he lived downstairs from us. And this is what his studio looked like. So it was an accumulation of sort of interesting people who lived in interesting ways. And we lived on the top floor. And this is a drawing that Todd did when we found out we were all being kicked out. But it is, here we are standing in the doorway of the living room. And there's a kind of circularity about it. There's a bathroom in the center, and you can move from the living room to kind of dining area, to a Pullman kitchen, to a kind of sitting area, tiny nook where our son slept. But it was very precise and very vertical. This is a kind of odd picture just before we were kicked out, and our son, who no longer lived there, but came back to sort of sit in his little bedroom where he grew up. Meanwhile, we climbed up these rungs, and we slept underneath the skylight. So this idea of a kind of floating in the middle of a city, being a part of a city, but being also in a way sort of isolated from it. And the desire, the sort of love of material culture, and the love of color and objects. That, along with that sense of never, I think, being a part of the mainstream culture, but knowing it well and therefore being able to observe it a little bit from the outside, has a lot to do with how we worked on our practice and continue to work on our practice. This was a very early show that we did where we, and this time we had met the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, who was the creator of these lamps called Akari. They're paper lanterns. They're very, very beautiful. They're still sold today. And we were asked to do a traveling exhibit of the Akari lanterns, which are both delicate but also very, very powerful. And one of the things we did was we took a series of screens that we made from fiberglass and took the lamps and put them behind the screens. So many times you saw the form of the lamp before you saw actually the lamp itself. And this had a lot of meaning for us because I think this idea of a kind of slowed perception of not necessarily revealing oneself immediately is very, very important in the work that we continue to do. So a lot of your early work and a lot of your early life experiences, I think, really in quiet ways over time will express themselves through any creative work that you choose to do. So This was a project that we won as part of a competition. And where the red dot is, it shows its location, which is in Hong Kong, in an area called the mid-level. So we're not down by the water, nor are we towards the top of the peaks, but we're in the mid-levels. And during the time of the early days of the British occupation, and always still, Hong Kong has been an important harbor. But our site where we located this, the Asia Society, overlooked a harbor and was actually a military building. And so these buildings, this is how we first saw the buildings, and they were sort of, they had been abandoned, but they were still in the middle of Hong Kong. And these are really sort of Victorian buildings. One of the things we had spent time doing, because my family my parents immigrated from Shanghai. So over the years, I've had the opportunity to go back and visit relatives in Shanghai, and was very influenced by Chinese gardens. So this sense of indirectness, once again, not immediately revealing what's ahead of you, really played a large part in our thinking about the renovation and restoration of historic buildings. So you can see that there are 4 historic buildings there, and then 1 new building, and then a zigzag bridge, because there is a gorge that ran between the historic buildings and the site of our new building, and it's crossed by a 2-level bridge, one on the upper level and one on a lower level. It's a very, very steep site. And the entryway has a very big portico, and the stone is from Vietnam, and it's a stone that really starts to recall a kind of jungle scene in Hong Kong. For those of you who may know it, it's certainly very tamed, but it also still feels very much like a jungle. And then looking and thinking about Chinese gardens, where one can look at a kind of moon bridge and see through to water on the other side. This is an idea where you could sit at a bench and hear the sound of water, which was falling on the other side of the wall. So this is the other side of that wall, and water is falling from a pond at the upper level to a pond at the lower level. And it's really so that when you pass through the building, you suddenly feel as if you're in old Hong Kong, and your shoulders drop, and you are much more in the jungle. You can ascend the stairs from that pool down below, and you're at the upper level. And here you can see the 2 levels of bridges, the upper level bridge and the lower level bridge. So the Asia Society was started by the Rockefeller family to help Americans understand Asia. And it has been a sort of cultural and business vehicle that's been there to connect particularly the United States and Asia. So it was in many ways also literally a bridge building, but also metaphorically a bridge building, because it's a bridge between the East and the West. And I've always felt neither one nor the other, this idea of a bridge, building that expressed itself as a floating bridge, was very, very important to us. And as part of the competition, I think that idea, that clear, strong idea of bridging from one side to another, was what helped us win the competition. At the upper level, there is a canopy, which is really recalls canopies in Chinese gardens, where you're walking along the path, and you can see that there are tracks in the ground, which are where during British times, small trolley cars filled with black powder moved across the site and were then put on like wires and wired kind of down to the lower level to the bay. they're very big mounds of earth that are contained by stone walls. And the British built those in order to separate what were magazines that were holding black powders. So if there were an explosion or a fire in one, these mounds of earth would protect the rest of the structures from also catching fire. It's a horizontal building in a very, very vertical city. It is, I think, for me, Hong Kong is one of the most vertical cities I've ever experienced. So sometimes in order to be powerful, you don't need to go in the same direction as everybody else, but you need to sort of find a way to go in an opposite direction. So rather than being vertical, this is a horizontal building. The next is, we call it a home for a community. This is Prospect Park. So Prospect Park, Central Park, are Olmsted and Vaux parks. Actually, Central Park came first, is larger. Prospect Park is in many ways a somewhat more lyrical park because it is freer. It's not held within the sort of grid of the city. There was an artificial lake in Prospect Park that was used for ice skating in the winter. And this historical photograph shows an island that's at the end of a long pathway. That island was called Music Island, and they actually would have performances on the island and people would sit around the edge. This was an Olmsted and Vaux drawing, which shows sort of carriage turnaround. There's a music island you can see at the center of the drawing, upper center of the drawing, and then a very formal, symmetrical layout of pathways that headed towards Music Island. This one that's more topographical says that, you know, there's a carriage turnaround, was a concourse, and this was the plan for Prospect Park. Over time, in the 60s, they built an outdoor skating rink, which had a lot of equipment. They filled in the area that was Music Island. So the concert grove sort of dead-ended into the back of a skating rink. And the carriage turnaround became just a huge parking lot. So we were given the commission to design a new skating rink. And as part of that commission, we worked with Prospect Park to restore Music Island, to restore the pathways of the concert grove. There are two rinks. One is outside, and the other is a regulation hockey rink, which is under a green roof, and that's Lefrak Center. So it's two rinks that are connected by a sort of umbilicus. And one of the things that we did in this project, it's very difficult to see, but we essentially buried most of the building beneath a series of paths. And this goes back to this idea of not necessarily always proclaiming oneself as an important building, but being more interested in making a place than making an object. So what you do see is this very, very big roof, which covers the regulation hockey rink, which is also used for roller skating, and I guess is being used now for outdoor roller skating. And it has lights in it. But as you enter the whole facility, you don't feel as if you're entering a building. There are many, many walls in Prospect Park that are made from this, a kind of schist, which is a local granite. Here we used granite from Canada, but we're really trying to make it feel as if you're simply walking between walls. Once you walk between the walls, you discover that you're underneath this roof. And the roof is something that Todd designed. It was really based on, I think he was just both thinking of the marks that figure skaters make in the ice. And so it was a series of very sort of lyrical, soft lines that were carved out of the, essentially it's a kind of drive-it, it's a sort of synthetic plaster. and painted silver. And then we have down lights, but the lights on the ice are so bright in terms of the reflectivity that it makes the silver lines look like they glow. And here you can see in the summertime, the ice goes away and it's being used for roller skating. And the outdoor oval rink is also a giant fountain and is being used for water play. And one of the things that we loved about this project was that although there's a cafe, and if you rent skates and go ice skating, you do need to pay for a ticket. In the summertime, for instance, this water play is totally free and open, and all the spaces are open. So this idea of democratic space, I think, is particularly important. And as we now know, outdoor space is very, very important. And it should not be under the purview, we believe, of a developer. It needs to be like Central Park, like Prospect Park, open to everybody who wants to come. And then this is the final project I'm going to talk about, which is the Obama Presidential Center. It's in Jackson Park in Chicago. So this is an image of the inauguration, which now seems like eons ago. But it's very, very powerful. And we were very honored. We were also very, very excited to be part of the competition, to be chosen to do this project. And we showed the President, Mrs. Obama, some images and words. And often when we design, we try to be very clear. And for me, words are very, very important. I'm a great reader of fiction. And so words always keep me centered. And so the two words ennoble and enable were very important in our conception of the Presidential Center. It was the sort of first African-American president. It was incredibly important that whatever we did was in a certain way acknowledging that this was a noble period of time. This was a noble act. He was a noble man, and that people would want to come and pay homage. At the same time, coming from the Obamas, they were less interested in ennobling, but in enabling. And here he is as a young man, being a community worker in Chicago. And one of the reasons why it's not called a library, there are a couple of reasons why it's not called a library, but a center, is because the programs are terrifically important, because this will be a place where young people, both locally, nationally, and internationally, will come to learn about civic engagement. How can you make the world a place that you hope it could be? So we showed these two images too, because the traditional idea of a presidential library is that it's about storytelling. It's a legacy. It's about papers. It's about piles and piles of bankers' boxes that are holding all of these papers. But this presidential center will be very much about story making. So it has both aspects to it: the ennobling, storytelling, the enabling, the story making. And one of the things that we were thinking about as we thought about the building was to try to make a campus. And in order to make a campus, of course, you need more than one building. But the first thing has to establish a kind of landmark. And that landmark is a tall building. And then there are two other buildings that hold a lot of the programs both on the ground floor and on the lower level. The third building will be a branch, will hold a branch of the Chicago Public Library. So the site is, you can see in red, is in Jackson Park. And once again, this is an Olmsted and Box Park, so we keep on visiting Olmsted and Box. There is Washington Park, which is the rectangle that you see to the left. And then Jackson Park, which it runs along the Lake Michigan shore. And there's a kind of spline that connects the two of the parks. And to the north of that is primarily the University of Chicago, and further north is downtown Chicago. South of that green spline is the south side of Chicago, Michelle Obama's childhood home, and also the Obama home. So here you can see in this image that to the north, you can see the towers of downtown Chicago. And then we are also very close to the Museum of Science and Industry. So it's a building that was built during the Columbian World's Fair and really was the only building that survived a huge fire. But this site, and actually pretty much sitting where our building will sit, was a horticultural building and the women's building. But they were all wooden buildings and they burned, and the only masonry building that survived is now the Museum of Science and Industry. So there's a football, a track and an athletic field on the site, and it will be moved further south. One of the things that we thought about was this image of hands. We wanted the building to feel like a lantern or a sort of beacon, and that the hands would be cupped to contain light. So this is the tall building. It is a about a 16-story tall building. It is shaped, and there is a kind of screen up at the very top left-hand corner. We went through a number of iterations, taller, shorter. These are looking at the different elevations. One of the things that President Obama wanted to do was to make sure that every facade had a different reading. And he is quite adept at both reading plans, and for the most part, I think his suggestions were made the building better. So the building was squatter, it got a little taller, its proportions changed. We're moving back and forth between something that was more rectangular, something that was more carved. But there was always this desire to, as he said, make a form that felt in its actual shape very elemental, but at the same time show, it was very important for us to articulate it in a way that was delicate and didn't make it feel unidimensional. And so you can see in the left-hand upper corner, there are words. And here we are actually looking at stone. These are stone mock-ups, and these are different kinds of American granite. One is from New Hampshire, the other one is from Maine. And we're looking at it both dry and wet. And one of the interesting things with stone is we love stone that's very irregular, and we love stone that's changeable. And when you think of, granite, you think, oh, it's the kind of same all the time. But like all living things, it has hidden surprises. And so the thing that was quite great about these two stones is that when it rains, it will be a very, very different building. I'll just go back. And you can see the difference that the moisture makes. But because it's such granite is such a dense stone, it dries very quickly. So it will very quickly go back to its other more sedate presence. And these, we decided at first we were going to do these out of carved stone, but it was too complicated and expensive. So we decided to use high performance concrete. And the words will eventually be from one of President Obama's most important speeches. And so those will, and here's an actual, that was earlier mock-ups, and this is a later, much bigger mock-up. They will, as you see in this top floor space, act as a sunscreen for looking out. So in the presidential center, the lower levels will be open to the public without ticketing. There will be a section which will be a museum. And then the upper level, this upper level will be open also to the public. I think that it will also have a very different sense because unlike the previous presidencies, which still relied a lot on paper, the Obama presidency was the first really digital presidency. So much of the communication actually was done digitally. And it became a very odd situation where people were saying, well, of course you have to have the paper. But then it seemed very strange because then you would have to print out things that had been sent digitally on a piece of paper and then put them in a banker's box and try to keep them safe from I don't know what. So in the end, they decided to digitize everything. And while there still will be actual papers, such as some of the speeches that Obama wrote and then rewrote, you can see as sort of corrections, those will be shown. But most of the material will be accessible online. So moving from, I think, a building which is about the past, this is very much a building that wants to be about the future. And it is at once, I think, very powerful about declaring itself and him as sort of iconic. And at the same time, it's trying to sort of be recessive. So you can see from this image that all of the low buildings actually have earth and trees planted on top of them, very much as you saw in the Prospect Park images, and are quite low and very open at the lower level. And here you're looking into what will be on the right-hand side, an auditorium and a cafe and an open winter garden where people will be able to come in and have a cup of coffee, use the Wi-Fi, use bathrooms. And then on the lower level, there are a series of classrooms. Here's an image of the branch of the Chicago Public Library, and through the big window, you can see there's another room which will actually be a room dedicated to books that President Obama has read or thought are important to be read. So that collection will be also a circulating collection. Some of the programs, My Brother's Keepers Alliance, the girls program that Mrs. Obama started, food programs. So there will be a productive garden that will be growing on top of the public library. And then just a quick look at one of the lower courtyards. So as life is happening on the main plaza, there is also a lower level, which is where all the classrooms are going to be. And there are very big courtyards which bring natural light into these areas so that it feels connected to the life at the ground level and also filled with light. And then this image, we have an underground parking garage. So we're changing the topography of the site, which was very, very flat. Chicago's the Midwest, so it's very, very flat. And actually creating a kind of sledding hill by burying the parking garage. And then this final image is really just saying once again that the practice of architecture is really not about a singular vision, and it's not about a singular person. It's not even necessarily about the group of people who call themselves architects. It's about a coming together of an understanding of the place of the site, but most importantly, the vision of the people who are going to be using your building. That is what forms, I think what forms the best architecture. When you answer people's questions, when you answer their needs, but in doing so, you are also, in a way, surprising them. I think that particularly now, but always, the basis of architecture is service. And there's a very big difference between, let's say, being servile, which is, in other words, having no opinion and just doing a service, and true service, where you bring your best to serve people. And from time to time, I think in doing so, in actually serving in a very, very deep way, and it doesn't have to be a large way, to go back to the beginning, it can be about lacing up your sneakers. It has the potential to be noble and have noble effects. So I thank you for virtually listening to me. It's so weird because when Pari was talking about people entering, I would still imagine the sound of people's feet coming in and, you know, chairs sort of slamming down. And now I imagine people's chairs kind of slamming up and some people kind of slipping out the back door. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Billie, for the wonderful lecture. And I forgot to mention that in the beginning, but our students can actually, we have about 100 people. And so our students can start asking questions and I will read them to you as they come in. So we already have a first question, which is, all of your buildings show an incredible attention to detail, specifically when concerned with texture. Could you expand on your conception of textures for ceilings in your process of placemaking?
One of the things I always tell students when they think about materials, because people have asked us, you know, how do you think about materials? How do you choose your materials? Is to look 360 degrees, look all around you. And the idea for textures or materials doesn't come from looking at other people's work. It doesn't come from going into some digital catalog and sort of scanning things. It actually has so much to do with peripheral vision. So things like, let's say the ice skating rink. The idea of, well, I'm going to talk about two things in the ice skating rink. And one of them has to do with peripheral vision, and the other one has to do with looking at what fabricators and other people do. And that's very hard to do when you're in school, but when you start to work, it's actually a very interesting part of working. So the stone we used, I said, well, you can't get this schist anymore because it's not quarried in Manhattan, even though it's the bedrock of Manhattan, but it's a kind of granite. So we looked around, and when you think about curbstones, there are curbstones all over everywhere. But where do those curbstones come from? And they can't be very expensive because they line all the streets. And so it turns out that, of course, granite comes from all over the place, but they're very big granite quarries in Canada. So Todd went to Canada and went to a place that does curbstones. And curbstones are big blocks of granite where they just take a giant cleaver and they just cleave it. And then they polish certain sides so that, you know, you get a smooth curb. But if you ever watch them laying a curbstone, it's not like this deep. It's more like 3 feet deep. It goes very, very deep. And so that was a very inexpensive way that you could get a rough face granite that could be applied to the building. So that had to do not so much with thinking, oh, I know the answer to this, but knowing that we were going to use a granite and paying a visit to the granite quarry and thinking, oh, this is a way that we can get a very rough finish without asking for a very special technique. So some things you just learn by going someplace, and you see somebody doing something off in the corner and it's like, wow, that's a really good idea. And other things, so that's working with looking at what people do. The other one is the sort of peripheral vision. Certainly ice skating, and I don't know what it means to do a figure skating, but this whole idea of figure skating, which used to be judged by the creation of a figure in the ice, seemed like a way, this idea of carving into the ice seemed very much a way that you could think about how you could decorate the ceiling. Because I don't know, what are you going to put up there? Like snowflakes? I don't know. But it could be much more about lines, and the lines could have to do with what is actually on the ice as you're doing it. So I think that the important thing is not to have preconceptions about how you want something to be. And that's hard because you're in school and you have a final review and you have to have the drawings done, but to feel in some way open so that not all aspects of your project are imagined and new, but there's some things, some things sort of tickles you and you decide to bring it in, and other things are sort of more standard. You can't make everything absolutely original. And I don't think anybody would want to be in a space that's absolutely original because it would be very confusing. So we need to have some things that are understandable, cool, and calm, and other times when some sort of interesting strangeness comes in. That's a very long answer, sorry.
Thank you. So the next question is from one of our students, Amanda Ferrante, who's asking, when will the project in Chicago be completed?
Well, so we have finished our construction drawings and we're on a temporary hold until after the election. So hopefully we can start construction in the first of the next year. I mean, there's so many issues right now as to how things get built and when things get built, but we're ready to go. And I think they're committed to the building. So if we start in the beginning of the new year, it will be a 2.5 to 3 year project for construction.
So the next question is from our department chair, Stephen Schreiber, who's asking, can you talk a little bit about the controversy related to the use of the park for the Obama Library?
Well, there are a lot of different controversies. Certainly, one of the controversies, I think that there's a group called Friends of the Park, and they felt that along with the Cultural Landscape Foundation, that it was, as an Olmsted and Vaux Park, it should not be disturbed. So our position is that, well, there are a number of reasons we've disagreed with that. Number one is that almost all of the major cultural institutions in Chicago are in public parks along the lakeside, with the exception, well, not even, I think the Museum of Fine Arts is also either in or adjacent to a public park along the lakeside. but it's a traditional sort of siting, like the, well, Science and Industry, but the aquarium, Museum of Natural History, they're all located along the lake. So it seemed to be not unusual to have a major cultural institution there. Then the second one is the position that it was Olmsted and Box and untouched. And actually it has been touched and changed a huge amount, because it was originally designed as a park, then it was redesigned as a site for the World's Fair, and then the World's Fair burned, and then it was redesigned again. So it has been touched many times. The last suit, as far as I know, by Friends of the Park has been dismissed. So I think there is not any more. There may still be controversy in people's minds, but there is not any more legal controversy.
Right. The next question regards how you work in your studio. So the question is, as a studio, how have you adapted the method of slowness in a digital world?
Well, you know, I suppose, of course, we use the tools of the digital world. And of course, the younger people in the office are adept and we are not. So part of the slowness has to do simply with the translation of things from one language into another. I think slowness also has to do a lot with the fact that Todd and I work on all projects together. And so it's never a kind of, this is the direction we're going. I was just talking before about being in a situation of where the client representative told us it really upset clients when Todd and I came in and we had disagreements in front of them. He said, I want you to be united. And I said, you know, after 37 years, it's pretty hard not to agree on everything. So I think some of the slowness also has to do with the negotiation between two sort of directions. And I think one of the great things is that he and I see the same goal, but we have different paths of getting there. So we can fight a lot, which may disturb people who aren't used to it. And it's not crazy fighting, but you know, it's disagreeing. But we are confident that, you know, that goal is where we're going. But, you know, I think we should take the flat path, and Todd thinks we should be climbing up the side of the mountain in order to get there. And then I think finally, you know, I think a lot has to do with Todd. He likes to keep options open. I mean, I think one of the ways partners can work together is when they're not similar, when they're dissimilar. And so I like to sort of have tidy little packages, and he likes to sort of shred them and keep options open. And in that way, it's a kind of, I always say that architecture is a sort of stutter step. You know, you're sort of like going 2 steps forward and then like half step backwards and 2 steps forward. And that plus the trying to work with people who value that kind of inquiry. And that's not, you know, you can't always control that. But one of the reasons why we haven't worked for developers is because I think that they are much more concerned with having something fast, clean, and done. And I think when we're working in the nonprofit world, that's much more how decisions are made in the nonprofit world. It's sort of people's opinions, bringing it together, kind of consensus, how do you move forward? And so it's a working method that's more in line with our working method, and therefore it allows us and them to work in ways that we're comfortable by choosing each other.
Okay, next question. There are a few more. So you spoke of a continuing thread in your work of not revealing everything at once, a sense of discovery, and of things that were important to you early in your career continuing to be explored. How does your current work blend both of your early interests?
I think that the one, I'm going to make a little segue and then it'll get to the work that we're doing now. So people always ask architects, what is your favorite building in the world? And, you know, Todd and I always say, we love Rome. We love the Pantheon. We love the fact that it is not a beautiful building on the outside that says, you know, I'm in the Pantheon. And if you didn't know, you know, you can approach it. For those of you who've ever been there, it's been many things over time. So it's kind of like battle worn. So you can approach it from different sides and it kind of just looks like a kind of pockmarked brick-ish sort of building. But when you go inside, there's an experience unlike anything you've ever had before. So that sense of a building, which that to us is the sort of most powerful experience. And, you know, Todd always likens it to saying, you know, when you're young, you think everything is about the outside and then you realize over time, and also maybe because you're outside, it's not looking as good as it used to, that it is so much about the inside. And when you think about where you live your life on the insides of buildings. So that experience, not being showy on the outside, informs all of our buildings. So whether it's the Prospect Park, which, you know, has its showy side, you know, we want you to get underneath that roof and go, wow. But it's not showing it all the time. Or, well, I didn't show the American Embassy in Mexico City, which is because Mexico City is so much about courtyards, is really based on life inside courtyards. So it's, you know, penetrating a wall, but entering a courtyard. So I think that sense of don't show everything at once to everybody, for me, is in a certain way both Asian, but also I think it's Todd's kind of personality too, that you get to know a person, actually another human being, better when you're not immediately sort of seduced by the exterior, but when you take the time to understand who they are as a real human being.
Wonderful. So there are a few more questions if you have the patience.
Okay.
Next one is, I think it is incredibly interesting that you lived in a place that surrounded you with art and people that worked in the arts. I'm curious how this experience of living near so many creative people has affected and changed your creative process.
I think a couple things, because I'm going to answer it both for myself and actually for our son, who really went from being was born, you know, and brought home from the hospital to there till he was in his early 20s. So that was, you know, his whole life. I think for me, the interesting thing was to understand that people surprise you, and and part of that was because there were so many eccentric people there living in that building. I mean, there was a woman who was a recluse who only came out at night, and she was a poet, and she was in her 80s, and she would do ballet exercises. Now you could say this is like a building full of crazy people, but it was also, to me, a sort of lesson in the kind of amazing strangeness of people, because we're all inside this building, we could sort of see each other. And for our son, I think it was interesting because, I mean, I grew up in, as I said, the child of immigrants. So my parents, my father was an engineer, my mother was a biochemist, they had jobs, they worked for companies, they worked for companies their entire lives until they retired. And that to me was stability. And somehow or other, I don't know, I got into architecture, which is very unstable, but ultimately very satisfying. And I realized that our son, having grown up not only with his parents being self-employed, but also seeing these people who seem to have their own universes, truly believed that he could create his own. So sometimes, you know, I worry for him because I think, like, what happens to you, you know, when you're 50 years old and you have to figure out what you're going to do. And at the same time, I realize he has an incredible foundation and belief in imagination. And I think that that's what living in that building did for him, and, you know, still does for us.
Okay, so we're going to try to only ask you 3 more questions. The first one here you've kind of partially answered. It's about your identity. And so it says, feeling both as a part and apart from the suburb America you grew up in. Do you think that your experience growing up has allowed you to break the rules when creating buildings, such as making a horizontal building in a vertical city, and so on and so forth?
I think it's good not to be too trapped, or not trapped is not the right word. I think it's good to not be too comfortable in your own history, to feel a little like you need to escape it. Maybe everybody who's young feels that, I'm not sure. I think being sort of racially, ethnically different from other people immediately made me feel not so comfortable in my own history. But I think so many people have other reasons, cultural reasons, passion reasons, love reasons why they may not be that comfortable in their own history. But I think to be able to understand your culture, but stand outside of it, I think is a very creative position to be in. I think if you're too much involved if you're too deeply involved in your culture, you can't either criticize it or reinvent it. And I think what architects and designers and people who write about creative process and who are creative, you are reinventing your own history.
Okay, the penultimate question has to do with the way you practice, how you structure your projects with respect to the rest of your office. How do you structure teams? What is the role of iteration, and how do you really start a new project?
Well, our studio is really is like a family. People are very dear to us. Teams people work in a project and they work all the way through the project. So we don't divide up by sort of specialties like, oh, you're the exterior wall person and you're the detail person. And that also has to do with the sort of education of an architect in general, that you learn that you're never a specialist. It's always about being a generalist. And I think when we start a new project, we try to re-say to ourselves what the problem is. And maybe the problem is not necessarily what the client thought the problem was. Because we're standing outside of, you know, the project. And so we try to use that distance to sort of think about what restating the problem is. And then we really try to understand the place and the site. So all of these things are very obvious. I mean, it is about a kind of deep and sympathetic listening before you can begin to articulate an idea. I mean, I think it's a big mistake for architects to imagine themselves always as the leaders. We need to fall back. And maybe now more than ever, we need to fall back and listen, because only through listening can we understand enough to start to think about what the right ways are to be. So this idea that the whole idea of style, I think, is something that really is not important anymore. And I'm also thinking as we're teaching, one might also say that, in the past you would say, oh, this is a student with talent. This is, an earnest student, but maybe less talent. I don't know that actually makes a difference anymore. Talent, no talent. I think that the role of the architect is changing, and it's about having an effect, and a positive effect. So because you can make a more iconic or signature building, to me, is starting to be not very meaningful.
Okay, so I have got a few more questions, but I'm going to try to combine at least two of them into one and let it be the last question of the day. So clearly, last questions are about the pandemic. Asking you in a way, how do you imagine the challenges of the pandemic, the divisiveness and racial injustice will really challenge and transform the work of architecture, and also a specific question about how the pandemic might also change the future of design of museums and public places. So I guess we can't really avoid talking about the pandemic in one.
Oh, you can't. You can't. It's interesting. I was just watching a webinar. It was the Design as Protest group in Dark Matter University. It was a number of different students who were talking about how the nature of education, architectural design education, would change, and what kind of architects, what should architects be learning. And there's a woman named Sharon Sutton who, I may have this wrong, but I think she was the first Black woman architect who was registered. And it's recent because she's definitely around. And she was talking, and she said, and I think it goes back to this idea of purpose and service. And is the higher goal now, the higher goal cannot be about sort of style. Higher goal needs to be about, in some way, purpose and service, because actually we are useful people. We have skills that are useful to people, and in very concrete ways, whether it's sort of space planning, sort of. One thing I was talking about with a friend today was, in New York, all the streets are now, not all streets, but so many streets are closed and restaurants are out in the streets. And it's actually a very hopeful, lovely moment, because people are eating outside. They're trying to support their local restaurants. They also just want to have a good time, and the restaurants are trying to do the best they can. And we're saying, well, maybe what we need to do as a group is to try to figure out what are the restaurants going to be doing in the winter. How can we as architects think of a way to provide a shelter that's still somehow outdoors that would allow restaurants to continue to work throughout the winter? It's like the lace up your shoes. It's like, what is the immediate thing? And I think that those sorts of topics are things that we can address and that we know how to do and we can have ideas about. So I think that understanding the local in order to address the pandemic is a way to feel, because we can often feel powerless. It's a way to take back some power. And I kind of forgot the final part of the question.
Well, I mean, I think it was a long question, but I think you've answered it. So we'll consider it answered. The questions keep coming in. I can keep asking you questions, but I think in all fairness, you've answered a lot of them. And so I just want to thank you on our collective behalf for coming to visit us and be with us this afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to see you across the screen. And I hope that one day you really come and visit us in person.
Well, I hope so too, but I just want to say to all the students, you have so much to give. You're so useful. You're so important. So there's a lot of stuff to do.
Thank you so much, Billie. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and hope to see all of you soon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.